1.05% of the popular vote and 486 of 538 electoral college votes. In 1972, the Republican presidential candidate Richard M. Nixon won a strikingly similar landslide, 60.67% and 520 electoral college votes. In the 8 years in between, the battle lines that define our culture and politics were forged in blood and fire. This is a book about how that happened and why. At the start of 1965, when those 8 years began, blood and fire weren't supposed to be a part of American culture and politics. According to the pundits, America was more united and at peace with itself than ever. 5 years later, a pretty young Quaker girl from Philadelphia, a winner of a decency award from the Kiwanis Club, was cross-examined in the trial of 7 Americans charged with conspiring to start a riot at the 1968 Democratic National Convention. "You practice shooting an M1 yourself, don't you?" the prosecutor asked her. "Yes, I do," she responded. "You also practice karate, don't you?" "Yes, I do." "That is for the revolution, isn't it?" "After Chicago, I changed from being a pacifist to the realization that we had to defend ourselves. A nonviolent revolution was impossible. I desperately wish it was possible." And several months after that, an ordinary Chicago ad salesman would be telling Time magazine, "I'm getting to feel like I'd actually enjoy going out and shooting some of these people. I'm just so goddamn mad. They're trying to destroy everything I've worked for myself, my wife, and my children." This American story is told in 4 sections, corresponding to 4 elections, in 1966, 1968, 1970, and 1972. Politicians, always reading the cultural winds, make their life's work convincing 50% plus 1 of their constituency that they understand their fears and hopes, can honor and redeem them, can make them safe, and lead them toward their dreams. Studying the process by which a notably successful politician achieves that task again and again, across changing cultural conditions, is a deep way into an understanding of those fears and dreams, and especially how those fears and dreams change. The crucial figure in common to all these elections was Richard Nixon, the brilliant and tormented man struggling to forge a public language that promised mastery of the strange new angers, anxieties, and resentments racking the nation in the 1960s. His story is the engine of this narrative. Nixon's character, his own overwhelming angers, anxieties, and resentments in the face of the 1960s chaos, sparks the combustion. But there was nothing natural or inevitable about how he did it, nothing inevitable in the idea that a president could come to power by using the angers, anxieties, and resentments produced by the cultural chaos of the 1960s. Indeed, he was slow to the realization. He reached it through the 1966 election, studying others, notably Ronald Reagan, who won the governorship of California by providing a political outlet for the outrages that, until he came along to articulate them, hadn't seemed like voting issues at all. If it hadn't been for the shocking defeats of a passel of LBJ liberals blindsided in 1966 by a conservative politics of law and order, things might have turned out differently. Nixon might have run on a platform not too different from that of the LBJ liberals, instead of the one that cast them as American villains. Nixon's win in 1968 was agonizingly close. He began his first term as a minority president. But the way he achieved that narrow victory seemed to point the way toward an entire new political alignment from the one that had been stable since FDR and the Depression. Next, Nixon bet his presidency in the 1970 congressional elections on the idea that an emerging Republican majority rooted in the conservative South and Southwest, seething with rage over the destabilizing movements challenging the Vietnam War, white political power, and virtually every traditional cultural norm, could give him a governing majority in Congress. But when Republican candidates suffered humiliating defeats in 1970, Nixon blamed the chicanery of his enemies, America's enemies, he had learned to think of them. He grew yet more determined to destroy them because of what he was convinced was their determination to destroy him. Millions of Americans recognized the balance of forces in the exact same way, that America was engulfed in a pitched battle between the forces of darkness and the forces of light. The only thing was, Americans disagreed radically over which side was which. By 1972, defining that order of battle as one between people who identified with what Richard Nixon stood for and people who despised what Richard Nixon stood for, was as good a description as any other. Richard Nixon now is long dead, but these sides have hardly changed. We now call them red or blue America, and whether one or the other wins the temporary allegiances of 50% plus one of the electorate, or 40% of the electorate, or 60% of the electorate, has been the narrative of every election since. It promises to be thus for another generation. But the size of the constituencies that sort into one or the other of the coalitions will always be temporary. The main character in Nixonland is not Richard Nixon. Its protagonist, in fact, has no name, but lives on every page. It is the voter, who in 1964 pulled the lever for the Democrat for president, because to do anything else, at least that particular Tuesday in November, seemed to court civilizational chaos, and who 8 years later pulled the lever for the Republican for exactly the same reason. Chapter 31. The Spring Offensive. Donald Segretti and Jeb Stuart Magruder ordered their legions forth into the next battles. Wisconsin on April 4th, Pennsylvania April 25th, Indiana May 2nd, Oregon May 23rd, California June 6th. In Milwaukee, where every serious candidate was pushing hard in the state where David had felled Goliath in 1968, Muskie supporters stopped showing up for campaign events. Too often, the candidate arrived late or not at all. Deliverymen and limousines kept on arriving at the senator's hotel, claiming to have been summoned by George Mitchell, one of Muskie's close advisors. The staff would then waste precious time arguing with some poor schlub that they hadn't ordered several dozen flowers, 50 pizzas, or 2 limousines at the last minute. Then they'd waste more time arguing over which campaign was working to sabotage them. By then, the whole day would be shot. The Humphrey campaign had been able to undo a rat fuck at the last minute by getting a notice into the Saturday Milwaukee Sentinel saying there would be no free lunch that afternoon with the candidate and Lorne Green of Bonanza, as advertised in a flyer circulated in the ghetto. Rat fucking took money and drained money away from throwing a proper National Party convention. The 1972 Republican meeting was to take place in San Diego, a nice, quiet, conservative Southern California city, nearby to the president's San Clemente retreat. But the city fathers had not cooperated, and the business community wasn't ponying up. So the White House approached an angel. The multinational conglomerate International Telephone and Telegraph had acquired 3 companies in 1969, in a deal bureaucrats in the Justice Department worried fell afoul of antitrust laws. Thus it was that in the middle of 1971, an ITT lobbyist named Dita Beard convened a Lollapalooza negotiating session whose principals included John Mitchell, Maurice Stans, John Ehrlichman, Chuck Colson, Bud Crow, and Vice President Agnew. The upshot, ITT promised $400,000 in donations to help stage the San Diego convention. Mitchell would protect the merger. The deal created more problems than it solved. As the Florida campaigning entered the home stretch, columnist Jack Anderson published a 1971 memo in which Dita Beard explained to her boss that their noble commitment has gone a long way. The memo also included the observation, "Certainly the president has told Mitchell to see that things are worked out fairly." Its famous last words, "Please destroy this, huh?" Beard's boss didn't. The reference to the President and Attorney General of the United States, now Richard Nixon's campaign manager, as direct parties to a bribe was a little more than embarrassing. So Howard Hunt was sent to cajole Beard into claiming she'd never written such a memo. "Who exactly do you represent?" Dita Beard's daughter asked of the red-headed stranger who appeared on her doorstep. "High Washington levels who are interested in your mother's welfare," he replied. Beard's public recantation clamped the lid on what Nixon feared was the biggest threat to his re-election so far. Convention plans were shifted to the island city of Miami Beach. Same palm trees and ocean vistas, with the added advantage of placating the networks, which would be able to keep their equipment in place from the Democrats' convention in July. Still and all, through spring, the ITT lid threatened to blow.
which was why G. Gordon Liddy and Howard Hunt brainstormed their own solution to the problem. Liddy no longer worked in the White House. Like Mitchell, and also former Commerce Secretary Maurice Stans, and former White House assistant Jeb Stuart Magruder, Liddy had been promoted to a more important job, with the Committee to Re-elect the President, John Mitchell, chairman. Harry Dent had wanted Magruder's job, but Bob Haldeman thought him too much of a Boy Scout. He refused dirty tricks assignments. Magruder was the committee's deputy director, Stans its treasurer, Liddy general counsel. And what the general counsel suggested at a meeting with Hunt and a physician who once specialized in non-detectable accidents for the CIA was that Jack Anderson be assassinated. A car crash, perhaps, or a drugging. Or, Liddy suggested, Anderson could just become a fatal victim of the notorious Washington street crime rate. Their consultation completed, Liddy pulled out a $100 bill from Committee to Re-elect the President funds to pay the good doctor for his time. Liddy carried $100 bills everywhere for such purposes. He was something of a sink for campaign cash. When Mitchell was still running the Justice Department, Liddy met with Magruder and John Dean in the Attorney General's office. He came loaded down with easels and flip charts, like an advertising account executive pitching a campaign for a new national brand, and presented his plan to keep the Democrats out of the White House. It was called Gemstone, he explained. Operation Diamond would field a Nacht and Nebel sabotage team, night and fog, Liddy said, translating from the German. The men would have mafia experience, he explained, warning, like top professionals everywhere, they don't come cheap. Ruby would tail the Democratic contenders. Cole would push Shirley Chisholm for the nomination. Emerald would eavesdrop on the Democrats' campaign planes and buses. Quartz intercept telephone traffic. Crystal float a barge off Miami Beach that would serve a double purpose, as electronic surveillance headquarters and a bordello to lure Democratic luminaries for blackmailable sex. Garnet was a plan for dirty hippies to stink up Democratic banquets. There were also Operations Opal 1, Opal 2, Opal 3, Opal 4, and Topaz. He saved Operation Turquoise, Cuban commando teams slipping by night into the Miami Convention Center during the Democratic Convention to sabotage the air conditioners, engulfing the hall in 110-degree heat, for last. John Mitchell smiled at that. What he did not do was order the man who had just marched into the office of the Attorney General of the United States to outline a massive criminal conspiracy arrested on the spot. When Mitchell heard Liddy's proposed budget, $1 million, he just asked him to come back with a cheaper plan. And Gordon, burn those charts. Do it personally. Liddy got it down to a bare-bones $250,000, which would require untraceable cash. The campaign itself, the traditional part, would cost hardly anything. It would consist mostly of the president acting presidential. But the Republicans still had to pay for their convention. They still had to set up campaign committees and local organizations, pay for their ad buys and literature. Magruder and Segretti's rat-fucking operations soaked up a budget of $100,000. Running a campaign plane and a press plane for Agnew would cost $171,088 a month for rental, $35,000 for modifications, $683 per liftoff, $325 per hour in the air, 6 cents a mile per passenger for insurance, plus the 8% transportation tax. Saving civilization from the Democrats would be expensive. And you couldn't exactly, in the wake of ITT, do it by approaching respectable Republican businessmen and asking them to cough up checks to finance rat fucks and prostitutes. Which was where the man who had learned about business at a sausage casings factory in Chicago in the 1930s came in, Maurice Stans. Ethics in the sausage casings business were not very high, he would later write in his memoirs. Neither were they at the Committee to Re-elect the President. Shakedowns had previously been Herbert Kalmbach's job. In October of 1971, for example, the president's personal lawyer approached the chairman of American Airlines at a dinner and asked him to kick in $100,000. The chairman said he might be able to come up with $75,000. Kalmbach told him he couldn't be sure of the consequences with the Federal Aviation Administration should the full $100,000 not be forthcoming. And so it was. Such corporate contributions were illegal. Companies maintained slush funds to wash the money. But by the time Stans came on board, the old schemes were set to become obsolete. On January 19th, the House voted final passage of the Federal Elections Campaign Act 334-19. It required the amounts of political contributions of more than $100 to be reported. Previously, only the contributor had to be listed. Nixon signed it with a flourish. By giving the American public full access to the facts of political financing, this legislation will guard against campaign abuses and will work to build public confidence in the integrity of the electoral process. He intended to follow its letter and pound its spirit into bloody submission. The law would go into effect on April 7th. A shakedown frenzy preceded that deadline. It worked, for instance, like this. Gulf Chemical sent $100,000 to the corporate account of a Mexican subsidiary, made out as a legal fee. A Mexican attorney then converted the money into 4 checks, payable to himself. He cashed them at the bank, then packed the bills into suitcases. It was flown in a plane belonging to Pennzoil and delivered to the office of Hugh Sloan, the Committee to Re-elect the President's accountant. A half-dozen pickup men wandered the nation over those 2 months. The take was an estimated $20 million. During one 2-day period, $6 million passed through Hugh Sloan's hand. Hints of the backroom orgy seeped out to reporters. "Mr. President," one reporter asked at a March 24th afternoon press conference, "will you give us your views on the general proposition of large political contributions either by corporations or individuals in terms of possibly getting something back for it?" "Nobody gets anything back," Richard Nixon replied. "As a matter of fact, I think some of our major complaints have been that many of our business people have not received the consideration that perhaps they thought that an administration was supposed to be business-oriented would provide for it." 2 reporters wondered in print why this obscure L.A. lawyer, Herb Kalmbach, had suddenly drawn so many of the nation's largest corporations to his once modest client list. The insolence sent the president over the edge. "They are out to defeat us," he rambled to Haldeman and Ziegler. "Both have spoken in the most vicious and derogatory terms of RN in the place where you really find out what these people think, the Georgetown cocktail party. The evidence on this is absolutely conclusive. You do not need to ask me where I got it." The Godfather opened in April, another of those allegories infiltrating movie houses about the rot that hid behind supposedly honorable institutions. It was a gangster movie of a new sort, one that proposed that successful gangsters had loving families, and that loving families, if they were successful enough, acted like gangsters. Francis Ford Coppola's masterpiece encapsulated the sort of false front creepiness, "I believe in America," were the picture's first words, liberals had noticed in Richard Nixon since the 1950s. A button started appearing. Nixon, Godfather in the White House. Sweet, gentle George McGovern made himself a vanguardist for campaign finance reform. His political director, Frank Mankiewicz, announced they would get their contributions on record 5 weeks before the deadline and called on all other candidates to pledge the same. As Wisconsin heated up, McGovern pointed out that only Nixon, Jackson, and Lindsay hadn't done so. "Muskie has been working on getting endorsements from the top down," McGovern said. "I have been getting them from the bottom up." Of John Lindsay, he said, "A handful of corporate leaders were bankrolling his campaign," explained a campaign aide. "It's the populism of the prairies against the populism of Park Avenue." McGovern's ability to raise clean money was to be one of his drawing cards. The thousands of small donations he was getting proof of his appeal at the grassroots, his longshot bids fetish phrase. His grassroots financing was indeed impressive. A young civil rights lawyer and son of an Alabama dirt farmer named Morris Dees had fallen in love with McGovern after hearing him speak in 1970. Dees was a millionaire in the relatively new business of direct mail. He'd been an innovator in the field since college, when he began a business to deliver cakes to kids on their birthdays, exploiting a list he had procured of University of Alabama parents as his secret weapon.
Welcome to
the
show.
Lists were everything in the direct mail business. He saw no reason political fundraising should be different.
The next 2 hours.
George McGovern didn't need convincing. In his 1968 Senate race, he had tried and failed to hire the king of political direct mail, conservative Richard Viguerie. Deese's first letter from McGovern, early in 1971, got an astonishing 15% response rate. Next, he signed up 3,000 members for a McGovern presidential club, each of whom pledged monthly contributions. The default rate was a mere 7%. Gut mail, a staffer called their appeal.
To be back in the studio.
Nothing canned. That was what George McGovern was selling. It was why he announced his candidacy in the first month of 1971, and in Sioux Falls instead of Washington. Leave it to the old polls to make their ritualistic disavowals of candidacy until the most strategically opportune moment. Muskie had been losing in part because he was so mumble-mouthed. McGovern would win by being forthright. His conviction that an untapped majority existed for a plain-speaking ideological honesty started reminding observers of Barry Goldwater. "I will not change my beliefs to win votes," the conservative had said in announcing his own candidacy in 1964. In Phoenix instead of in Washington. "I will offer a choice, not an echo." McGovern said much the same. That wasn't the only thing that reminded people of Goldwater. Like him, McGovern didn't behave like a candidate who wanted to win. Others avoided the thorny issue of amnesty for draft dodgers. McGovern sallied forth at Keene State College in New Hampshire and said the evils of the war itself had already vindicated them. Eleanor McGovern, pointing out that only 20% of the country agreed, pleaded with her husband to make amnesty contingent on performing alternative service. He stuck to his guns. Sticking to his guns was what he was running on. In Florida, he came out for busing as one of the prices we are paying for a century of segregation and housing patterns, and against the space shuttle program, Central Florida's great hope for economic recovery. He toured Chicago without the blessing of Mayor Daley, an unheard-of slight, and then, at the state capitol in Springfield, announced that his delegate slates for the March 21st Illinois primary had to be scrapped and reformed because they didn't meet the McGovern Commission's guidelines for gender balance. He was too good for his own good. But then maybe this was what it would take for Democrats to win in 1972. The Godfather was in the White House. The old ways no longer seemed to hold purchase. In January, DNC Chair O'Brien had put on a good old-fashioned $500 a plate fundraising banquet to try to retire the party's debt from 1968. It felt like an old song for which everyone had forgotten the words. Humphrey didn't stay for dinner. McCarthy refused a chance at the podium. Ted Kennedy shifted in his seat as if he had wound up in the wrong room. Fred Dutton signed on with the McGovern campaign, along with his fellow RFK compatriot, Frank Mankiewicz. Maybe what Dutton told Scotty Reston was right. Maybe the emerging Democratic majority really was nadir populist at heart. Frontrunner Muskie was sounding more and more like McGovern, promising that Vietnam will remain an issue for me as long as a single human being dies, not for a cause, but for a mistake. In March, after McGovern's second-place shocker in New Hampshire, two surprising developments in the heart of the heartland helped convince prairie populists they were right. The first was in Lordstown, Ohio. A new General Motors plant had opened in the economically suffering region. To staff it, GM followed the new industry trend of hiring younger workers. They got sick less and used up fewer benefits, an important cost hedge against onrushing Japanese competition. Meanwhile, GM's new assembly division was radically reorganizing the production process for greater efficiency. The two developments collided in 1971, when Lordstown changed over models to Chevy's new import-style subcompact, the Vega. The line's old rate was 60 cars per hour. For Vegas, the rate was to be doubled. The old way was to compensate for such hardships with fatter wages and benefits. Steady work and pride in producing excellent machines had always been blandishment enough to compensate the Vega workers' depression-scarred parents for the monotony and alienation of factory work. But GM had not counted on the consequences of plunking a car factory full of kids down the street from Kent State. Working-class youth were starting to think like new leftists, identifying the meaning of life with the struggle for authenticity. Ford's labor relations chief described a new breed of union member, a younger, more impatient, less homogeneous, more racially assertive, and less manipulable member. Absenteeism and disciplinary citations doubled. Turnover almost tripled. Problem employees, the Ford expert said, almost habitually violate our plant rules. He worried about a general lowering of employees' frustration tolerance. The New Left had a word for that. They called it alienation. The old line UAW leadership pushed GM for more wages and benefits. The workers responded, in defiance of their union, by passing cars down the assembly line with parts missing. Every day I come out of there, I feel ripped off, one young worker told a radical labor union researcher. I don't even feel useful now. They could always find somebody stupider than me to do the job. The plant's various cultural factions, hillbillies, blacks, Puerto Ricans, hippies, united in February against a new Get Tough policy against worker absenteeism. 97% voted to stop work. The Wall Street Journal monitored this unprecedented new quality of life strike obsessively, in almost the same terms as radicals. The generation just entering the workforce, the Journal worried in a March 15th editorial, The Soul Must Panic, were lashing out at the monster of monotony. Politicians monitored the strike closely too. Here was a new kind of political demand. The Lordstown strikers lost. The March 23rd settlement answered none of the anti-monotony demand. The heralds of the new politics took the message nonetheless. That greening of America values and the emerging coalition Duffy described, humanistic, critical of big business, big labor, and big government, were taking root in the heart of the heartland, amid the old politics' supposedly sturdy labor base. The second boost for prairie populist confidence unfolded in Pennsylvania's Susquehanna Valley. It had seemed obvious to radicals and new politics liberals what Richard Nixon's Justice Department was up to in the trial of the Harrisburg Seven. The proliferating gaggles of activists thrown in front of juries as conspirators, from the Harlem 4 to the Fort Hood 43, were evidence of conspiracy itself. An organized campaign of repression against anyone who dared threaten the powers that be. The people of this country will be watching this trial, a defense statement for the Harrisburg Seven roared, to see if men and women who have cried out to the government, "Thou shalt not kill," will be put in jail for that. The conspiracy attitude was easy to mock. Did you hear the one about the Indianapolis 500? They're innocent, the hippie replied. Every last one of them. But this prosecution was obviously Kafkaesque. A nun who taught art history at a college in upstate New York and a pacifist priest were supposed to have plotted with fellow nuns and priests and a college professor to blow up Washington and to kidnap Henry Kissinger unless their demand for an end to the war was met. Overt act number 23 in the indictment was that one of the nuns moved from Baltimore to Washington. Soon, the protest community was convinced they would all be in prison. The Village Voice's reporter in Harrisburg, Paul Cowan, had already bought a house in Canada in preparation for the final crackdown. What he saw of the jury selection convinced him it would come soon enough. Mary McGrory of the Washington Post columnized that the defendants had already been condemned. They have fetched up in a locality where moral passion is considered a social error, among citizens who have either decided they are guilty or who smugly declared they were too busy to read about the whole affair. The Justice Department agreed with the radical. It would be a piece of cake to get a jury of terrified silent majoritarians to sentence riffraff like this to an eternity underneath the jail, whatever the weakness of their case. The proceedings took shape in February as doppelganger to Judge Hoffman's in Chicago. The hulking glass federal building and sterilely modernist federal courtroom, the obsessively sequestered jury. This time they boarded up the windows of the jury bus. Some of the same radical lawyers, the same sort of tough-as-nails Roman Catholic prosecution team, the lead attorney had been plucked from the mafia beat. The defense once more welcomed the opportunity to conduct a political trial and get the issues before the American people. A hanging judge boasted of his contempt for the Fourth Amendment. "Speak for yourself. I have nothing to hide," he answered a defense lawyer who said government surveillance hurts all of us. Once again, the star witness was a police spy. Boyd Douglas was a fellow inmate of Philip Berrigan's at Lewisburg Penitentiary. He had been allowed into a study release program at nearby Bucknell University, which was how he helped Father Phil smuggle uncensored letters to Sister Elizabeth, from which they discovered Father Phil's reveries about whether the progress in ending the war would be hurt or hastened by kidnapping government officials, as radicals had in Quebec. But before Douglas could take the stand, his credibility as a witness was in tatters. The prosecution accidentally released to the defense a letter he'd written to the FBI, thanking them for money to buy a new car and shaking them down for some more. Considering what I will go through before and after the trial, or trials, I request a minimum reward of $50,000 tax-free.
Number 7.
He also asked for a faked honorable discharge from the Army. It didn't do much for the prosecution's claim that their star witness was a strict Catholic and conscience-stricken former New Leftist. Editorials compared Boyd Douglas's $50,000 request to the Nixon White House's shakedown of ITT. Then Douglas took the witness stand. The letters he'd written to co-eds were read into the record. "I have given my life to the struggle," went one. "If I lose freedom and life to the movement, that's the way it has to be. I got warm vibrations from you." Then he invited her for a tryst. He had to admit, too, to lying to his handlers, holding back material that might further incriminate the priest to bargain for more money. On March 15th, the jury learned that an early FBI evaluation of Douglas judged him as having many of the attributes of a confidence man. It got worse. That same day, the key informant in the Camden 28 conspiracy case filed a pre-trial affidavit telling the story about how he had innocently approached the FBI in the hopes of foiling a draft board raid some of his friends were planning, and was then recruited by the FBI, trained in breaking and entering techniques, and instructed that under no circumstances was the raid to be suspended, because higher-ups, someone at the little White House in California, he was told, wanted it to actually happen. The next week, in Harrisburg, 2 weeks before the New Hampshire balloting, Boyd Douglas's FBI handler testified he had never known Douglas had been classified by a U.S. attorney as a menace to society. The government's case was unraveling. But the government's case against the Chicago 7 had been a shambles, too. And what difference had that made in preventing conviction? This defense decided to rest without dignifying the charges with a response. The 7 defendants voted on that 4-3. It demonstrates, one of them told the press, we can never possibly be conspirators because we can never agree, which hadn't mattered in Chicago either. The jury withdrew to deliberate. The defendants steeled themselves for another silent majority jury nullification. An article appeared in the Chicago Sun-Times describing a defendant as an ex-rapist instead of an ex-priest. The mortified editor sent a letter of apology, acknowledging that one of the working-class printers in the press room might have introduced the error as an editorial comment. The jury deliberated a 5th day, then a 6th. One of the 12 kept pounding the table, invoking God's will, telling the story of another jury he had served on in which he had acceded to a not guilty verdict. Then God struck down the defendant with a heart attack a few days later. He demanded this bunch be jailed unanimously and immediately. On the 7th day, the jury returned a mistrial verdict. Paul Cowan of the Village Voice wrote of his shock, "At first, I attributed the verdict to the moral rectitude of the defendants, to the skills of their famous lawyer, to the sociologist's expertise. In other words, I believed that the specter of Main Street had been neutralized by the special skills of the urban elite." But later, Cowan did something remarkable. He interviewed the jurors. They said things like, how stupid did those people in Washington think they were? They weren't, this radical realized, so different from him. They bore frustration and rage that sat in their guts like rocks. They wished they had been able to retain the faith in the government they had brought to the trial, just as Cowan had earlier in the 1960s. Talking to them, he concluded, I realized that for many Americans, democracy is a religion. He began to feel a bit of that old-time religion himself. Sometimes it is possible to unify Americans, he realized, in situations that call for generosity or fairness, instead of dividing them into battles over physical or psychological turf. The alienated radical sounded like the preacher's son McGovern. The lessons of Lordstown and Harrisburg seemed to suggest more and more Americans were uniting behind a new politics message. Central Pennsylvania and central Ohio were just the kind of places McGovern was determined he could reach. He seemed to be proving it was possible that Main Street would vote for an anti-war liberal. The AFL-CIO revealed a poll it had taken in Wisconsin. McGovern was in the lead. It seemed a vindication not only of the new populism, but also of a year and a half's work. The McGovern campaign had begun just after the 1970 election. Gary Hart, McGovern's campaign manager, recruited a 24-year-old named Gene Picorni off a feed grain farm who'd been a legendary McCarthy organizer in Nebraska. By then, he was contemptuous of McCarthy for not having McGovern's hunger to win. Hart sent Picorni to Wisconsin to make their stand in the state that had driven Lyndon Johnson from office, the home to 1920s progressive hero Fighting Bob La Follette and tail gunner Joe McCarthy, two very different politicians whose commonality was a grassroots following contemptuous of the Washington establishment. Picorni was met 17 months before the primary with no little bafflement. But the jumpstart was key to Hart's national strategy. By locking up the left-wing activist base early, McGovern denied it to the other new politics aspirants. The sentimental candidate himself, in a memo to strategists, was excited for the early start for another reason: to have an opportunity to educate an entire nation and to learn from an entire nation over the period of the next 2 years. That is its own reward. McGovern wrote ingratiating letters to anonymous activists in 1971, as assiduously as Richard Nixon had written to newspaper publishers and J. Edgar Hoover in 1965. Flattered, they gladly advanced his visits, of which McGovern kept up a wall-to-wall schedule. The campaign always announced its events as receptions, not rallies, in case only a dozen showed up. While Nixon operatives were taking meetings with ITT lobbyists and kitting up executives for $100,000 checks, Hart had field men organizing rummage sales, petition drives, and workshops on how to canvass and set up storefronts. At McGovern's Washington headquarters, it was next to the liquor store in a neighborhood so dangerous, cabbies wouldn't drive there. Supporters worked through the night. Just like Nixon's plumbers, McGovern's students were convinced they were fighting to save civilization. Winning Wisconsin was the key. They would never be able to afford to organize so thoroughly again. At Picorni's insistence, McGovern had spent 72 hours in the Badger State at least once every 3 months, beginning early in 1971. Many towns had never before seen a presidential candidate. And even on the radio, they'd rarely heard one who could speak so authoritatively and sympathetically on agriculture. The fact is that over the past 20 years, livestock prices have remained the same, while the meat marketing margins have doubled, the editor of the scholarly volume Agricultural Thought in the 20th Century would say. The farmer's share of the consumer's food dollar has fallen from 47 cents in 1952 to 38 cents today. A squad of professionals arrived 2 weeks before the balloting, bivouacking in an out-of-the-way motor lodge in Milwaukee, inheriting volunteer organizations in every one of the state's 72 counties. 10,000 volunteers in Milwaukee alone. In the 4th District, the south side of Milwaukee, where the voters were Polish, just as Edmund Muskie was Polish, and had beaten civil rights marchers nearly to death in 1967, and had gone for Wallace in 68 and 64, McGovern volunteers from 20 states, as young as 13 years old, slept on the linoleum floor of a toy warehouse. Headquarters wouldn't waste bumper stickers on such inhospitable soil. The volunteers canvassed past dark all the same, in a Milwaukee spring where the average daytime high was 34 degrees. Teddy White compared them to the forces of North Vietnam's General Giap, living off the land, tapping veins of frustration everywhere, raising money locally as they rolled, stirring to action hearts hitherto unstirred by politics. Timothy Krause in Rolling Stone invoked the guys who were in the hills with Castro. It wouldn't have worked if the peasantry and the proletariat weren't willing to be stirred. McGovern held a press conference in the home of a Polish family squeezed by property taxes that was featured in the New York Times. You get more money, but it just don't do nothing, Richard Wasaki, a car mechanic, said, gesturing thankfully to his South Dakotan protector. McGovern started dropping in on bowling alleys on league nights. Word spread like wildfire. his earnest young traveling aide, Gordon Wilde, recalled. It turned into a triumphal tour. McGovern's favor among blue-collar voters became the key to his campaign strategy. George Wallace called a press conference the day after the Florida primary to announce he was coming to Milwaukee. He was armed with a poll showing he had just won 50% of the Democrats who had voted for Nixon in 1968 and one-third of Florida's new under-21 votes. What has happened here in Florida just makes it more clear to me, and ought to make it clear to anybody with good sense, that I am a serious candidate for the nomination. McGovern welcomed the test. He called Wallace's Florida showing an angry cry from the guts of ordinary Americans against a system which doesn't give a damn about what's really bothering the people of this country today. Busing, he said, was merely a symbol of all these grievances rolled into one. Wallace, Nixon, Jackson, and Humphrey were using it to take people's minds off the problems which really concern them. The Wednesday before the election, the kind of late-season blizzard fell on southern Wisconsin that people printed up T-shirts to commemorate. Muskie was speaking, gutsily, in Kimberly, Wisconsin, a company town, for his proposal to ban the nation's biggest 200 companies from further expansion in size. Kimberly-Clark was number 141, and was stranded. Jackson, shifting his appeal from busing to hitting Nixon for his elaborate machinery on wage controls, but virtually nothing on price control. Defending himself from charges his campaign was being financed illegally by Boeing executives' traveler's checks, got stuck in the sparsely inhabited north. Humphrey and Lindsay were socked in too, and it seemed as if a sign. Only McGovern plowed through to his next event. A POW's wife standing loyally by the candidate's side, he cried that the truth is that only by ending the war can we get our prisoners of war released, that Richard Nixon's continued bombing ensures that American prisoners will remain in their cells. The issue would become more pressing within days. South Vietnam had dodged a Tet season attack by keeping ARVN troops in their barracks until the end of the holiday. Strategists presumed the communists would save their final offensive for 1973, by which time many more U.S. troops would have been withdrawn. Instead, they staged a 1972 spring offensive. Some 120,000 North Vietnamese regular troops poured over the 17th parallel, accompanied by the communists' most intense rocket and artillery bombardment of the war. By the first day of April, the entire South Vietnamese 3rd Division was in retreat. The next day, one of its regiments stripped off their military insignia and joined the civilian refugees streaming south. The day after that, another regiment bartered for their lives by turning over their artillery cannons. Another spectacular failure for Vietnamization, exactly 1 month before American forces were scheduled to draw down to 69,000 troops. Richard Nixon half welcomed the news. It was, in a way, his Gulf of Tonkin incident, his excuse to move all in with the hellfire knockout punch he'd been dreaming about since planning Operation Duck Hunt. The mission was christened Operation Freedom Train. The president ordered a fleet of B-52s to carpet bomb the demilitarized zone. But in Quang Tri, as in Wisconsin, foul weather clouded the sky. Air Force brass told the men not to fly. So Kissinger brought in a new Air Force general, named him Air Commander, and gave him a 4th star, bypassing Admiral Morrill. Nixon delivered a Patton-esque speech to Bob Haldeman and started bombing with savage intensity. The bombs started falling on primary day, which the Today Show observed with a half-hour live from Milwaukee. Jackson, Wallace, and Humphrey massed in anyone but McGovern chorus in favor of the bombing. The government should take whatever action is necessary to protect the remaining residual troops. Since Muskie didn't mention the matter in his sentence, the president told Haldeman to get to work attacking him for showing no concern for the POWs or the protection for the 70,000 GIs. Bad weather favors insurgents. At 9:40, Frank Mankiewicz announced McGovern had taken 7 of Milwaukee's 9 congressional districts, including the 4th, where the residents had beaten the civil rights marchers in 1967, and the 5th, which an organizer described as Archie Bunker Street drawn out to infinity. McGovern called his victory a vote of protest and hope. Reporters, having missed the story of McGovern's awesome organization, began typing phrases such as stunning victory and noting that the third-place finisher, Humphrey, who had the full endorsement of the state AFL-CIO and was supposed to be so beloved in the Badger State that they called him Wisconsin's third senator, edged out Muskie, but that Muskie was edged out in turn by George Wallace. "Senator Muskie, are you finished?" a reporter asked. More or less, he was. Senator Henry Scoop Jackson tied for the booby prize with the matinee idol mayor of New York. Lindsay's press secretary lost $102, having bet his man would pull 10%. Lindsay only ended up with 7 and quit. George Wallace held strong in second place. The next day, McGovern people started laughing at the establishment that had been laughing at them. His janissaries made calls to incredulous reporters, claiming that despite his being in 4th place in national polls, despite his having earned only 95 of the 1,508 delegates required to win, McGovern had just about sewn it up, thanks to his strength among activists in caucus states. Time started planning a McGovern cover. Evans and Novak noted the emergence of an anybody-but-McGovern movement. Then, the day that Wisconsin helped clarify the confusing Democratic picture, the White House got to work on reclouding it. The P wanted to be sure that we get people to follow up on the line, that Kennedy is now the obvious Democratic candidate, Haldeman wrote in his diary. He liked my idea of waiting a few days and then having Connally give Teddy Secret Service protection. The Secret Service were under Connolly's Department of the Treasury, on the basis that there's general agreement that he's going to be the candidate. On April 6th, B-52 planes pushed 60 miles farther north, accompanied by headlines like, "A big new phase of war is opening." McGovern was now being called the stalking horse for Kennedy, as the Massachusetts senator gave his most lacerating anti-war speech to date. The simple truth is that this test of Vietnamization, with or without American support, is a wholly immoral and unjustifiable test, because it is a test that is being carried out with the lives of men, women, and children. Those dead and dying bodies stretched out beside the road across our television screens last night are the bodies of human beings. We do not have the right, no one has the right, to demand a test like that. $10, $20, $50 checks with angry notes attached about ending the slaughter started flooding McGovern headquarters. Nixon campaign headquarters, a block from the White House, was even more the maelstrom. The Federal Elections Campaign Act went into effect the next day, and the suitcases full of cash and negotiable securities were flying in a frenzy. Rosemary Woods scribbled out a makeshift list of all the money they were scrambling to process to keep track of their chits. Later, that list was entered into evidence in a congressional investigation and earned the nickname Rosemary's Baby. The next big day for Democrats was April 25th, with primaries in Massachusetts and Pennsylvania. On April 10th, the president sent the B-52s another 90 miles north. He also made a carefully coded diplomatic utterance at a signing ceremony for the Biological Weapons Convention. Every great power must follow the principle that it should not encourage directly or indirectly any other nation to use forms of armed aggression against one of its neighbors. Henry Kissinger was due in Moscow in 9 days to cement the details for a presidential visit, scheduled for the last week in May, or final talks and perhaps the signing of a strategic arms limitation treaty, under negotiation since November of 1969. Decoded, Nixon's message meant, "We've noticed that the North Vietnamese are fighting with better weapons provided by you. Desist, or lose your summit, your treaty, and your chance to increase your influence with the United States, to balance out your rival China's influence with the United States. Desist, or the South Vietnamese government might fall before the U.S. presidential elections. Whenceforth, Richard Nixon would be very, very angry." But Russia hardly wanted to seem a pushover on the eve of a summit. The diplomatic task was complex. Domestic politics, too, were difficult to juggle. On April 12th, Nixon and Kissinger explained to the Republican congressional leadership why they were sending them into an election season while increasing the number of active B-52 bombers in the Vietnam theater from 45 to 130, ships from 22 to 40, and fighter bombers from 150 to 275. "What the enemy seeks," said their president, "is to inflict such a defeat on the ARVN that the government of South Vietnam would collapse and create so much turmoil in this country that we will collapse. Then they will go into negotiation. The enemy attacked now, the president said, because they couldn't hold out for another year. Decoded, that meant, I am about to finish the job, and those who object will have stabbed their country in the back. On April 16, 5 behemoth B-52s pounded Hanoi in North Vietnam's lifeline port, Haiphong Harbor. Fighters strafed down below. Among the casualties were 4 Russian ships. Nonetheless, 3 days later, Kissinger proceeded to Moscow without Politburo objection. The summit was on. Richard Nixon had won the diplomatic battle. He still had a political test ahead, keeping his credibility with the public. He embarked on a series of photo ops, flying up to Ottawa, signing a Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement with Canada to mark the 3rd annual observance of Earth Day, meeting the table tennis team from the People's Republic of China, commending the District of Columbia's police for a decline in the crime rate, signing an executive order for a national center for housing management. Then, the night of April 26th, he went on TV to make his latest Vietnam pitch. Our draft calls now average fewer than 5,000 men per month. We have offered the most generous peace terms. The South Vietnamese are fighting courageously and well in their self-defense. 20,000 more American troops would come home by July 1st. We would return to Paris to negotiate, thanks to the effectiveness of the air and naval strikes. We are not trying to conquer North Vietnam or any other territory in the world. That is why I say to you tonight, let us bring our men home from Vietnam. Let us end the war in Vietnam. But let us end it in such a way that the younger brothers and the sons of the brave men who have fought in Vietnam will not have to fight again in some other Vietnam at some time in the future. My fellow Americans, let us therefore unite as a nation in a firm and wise policy of real peace. Not the peace of surrender, but peace with honor. Not just peace in our time, but peace for generations to come. Thank you, and good night. It marked a profound chasm between the public and private transcripts. The previous day, Henry Kissinger had outlined their next options: hitting power plants, docks, mining Haiphong Harbor, bombing civilians. I think we ought to take the dikes out now, Nixon offered. I think, will that drown people? That will drown about 200,000 people. Oh, well, no, I'd rather use a nuclear bomb. Have you got that ready? That, I think, would be too much. The nuclear bomb, does that bother you? I just want to think big, Henry, for Christ's sake. Kissinger paused, taken aback. He collected himself, eventually responding with the one thing he knew would talk the president down from his flight of fantasy. I think we're going to make it. Until Election Day, he probably meant. Saigon would hold on at least until then.
Up next,
Democrats voted in Pennsylvania and Massachusetts. It was a split decision. The new politics took the Bay State. The old politics took the Keystone State. Massachusetts was more or less preordained. Massachusetts' plentiful anti-war Democrats had held a January caucus in which they agreed to unite behind a candidate who got more than 60%. McGovern, in the first public flexing of his organization's depth, did so comfortably. That he couldn't afford a campaign plane during the days of the New Hampshire primary had also helped. He would instead take commercial flights from Boston, campaigning there before boarding his campaign bus for Manchester, while endorsement Ed soared overhead at 30,000 feet. The Tortoise won Massachusetts virtually unopposed. The next day, the Hare, New England's own Edmund Muskie, finally dropped out of the presidential race. Pennsylvania was more interesting. Muskie, Wallace, and McGovern tied for second at about 21%. McGovern did reasonably well. The plurality, however, went to Hubert Horatio Humphrey. A story lay behind that. The Keystone State was where old-line labor, whose former commanding influence in brokering Democratic presidential nominations had been eviscerated by the reformed nominating process, staged its revenge. The AFL-CIO's president, George Meany, was a dyed-in-the-wool war supporter. If we don't fight them there, we're going to have to fight them in San Francisco, he'd said in 1965, before engineering a 2,000-6 vote against an anti-war resolution at a labor convention. Having surrendered their king-making role to ordinary primary voters, who were proving to be alarmingly amenable to the candidate of the anti-war hippies, Old Line Labor now made its move to take McGovern out. Its vehicle was old, reliable Hubert Humphrey. It had first been tried in Wisconsin. Badger State labor leaders told their memberships not to vote for McGovern because he hadn't voted to end a right-wing filibuster against an anti-labor right-to-work law in 1966. This was nasty politics. Actually, McGovern's labor voting record was just about flawless, better than John F. Kennedy's in 1960. So good, in fact, that he feared for his re-election in 1968 in a conservative state like South Dakota. Upon which, George Meany, like some labor pope, had granted McGovern an absolution to vote against right to work in 1966. In 1971, Meany had explicitly signed off on McGovern as an acceptable Democratic nominee. Now, in 1972, the Pope ordered his Wisconsin bishops to use that vote to call McGovern a traitor to labor and turn out their machine for Humphrey. They had been no match for McGovern's Badger State Army. McGovern had no army in Pennsylvania. He had spent all his forces in Wisconsin. But big labor always had an army at the ready. Pennsylvania was Humphrey's first primary win in 3 presidential campaigns. Muskie and Jackson had been rebuked by the voters. Evans and Novak were reporting that any chances Ted Kennedy would enter the race were done for good. That left anybody but McGovern with a name and a face. A smiling, exuberant face, which was the soul of the divided Democrats' misfortune in the spring of 1972. Hubert Humphrey personified for New Politics voters the forces who'd stood by when kids were beat up in the streets of Chicago in 1968. At the University of Pennsylvania, he was heckled as America's #2 war criminal. As he strolled down Chestnut Street in Philadelphia, a long-haired youth screamed in his face, "I don't see how you can smile when all those bombs are dropping on innocent civilians in Vietnam. You have no right to smile." The nomination had come down to this: the purest possible old politics versus new politics showdown, a democratic civil war. The neatness of the Democrats' divisions was almost suspicious. The only logical explanation of the Democratic presidential campaign so far, Scotty Reston wrote in his New York Times column at the end of April, is that it must have been planned by the Republicans. Little did he know, his joke was literally true. The White House was delighted at George McGovern's ascendancy. He was the one serious contender they had never ratified. They loved the combustion between the kind of people who loved Humphrey and the kind of people who liked McGovern. They themselves had helped set the fuse. The sudden surge in Senator Hubert Humphrey's prospects for another bout with Richard M. Nixon, Evans and Novak wrote in their April 27th column, the day after the Massachusetts and Pennsylvania primaries, is more the product of Senator George McGovern's spectacular landslide in Massachusetts. Despite his apparent success in the bowling alleys of Beertown, he'd only won 10% of the blue-collar wards in the Bay State. McGovern is now being taken with infinitely more seriousness, the columnizing duo wrote. Since Wisconsin, his eager and talented volunteers have flooded precinct conventions in such non-primary states as Kansas, Missouri, Vermont, and Idaho to ambush the regulars. And now those regulars fear McGovern as the Democratic Party's Barry Goldwater.
This one, Absolute Percy, was stalking this one on Discogs for about 4 months. Didn't fancy paying 25 quid. You'll be happy to know I got it for about 12 quid in the end. Never give up. So yeah, next up, this week I'm out there in Ireland, me and Joy O. We're doing a little mini tour, Galway, Cork, Belfast, Dublin. I'm just stoked because I'm going to be there on St. Patrick's Day. So yeah, if you're about in Ireland, shout out to my Irish crew. Yeah, get down, be great to see ya. Out to the All City Boys, out to Dara Carolan. Out to you and yours, wherever you're locked in from. Big up.
They were ready now to fight back. For instance, by wielding not-for-attribution quotes like daggers in Evans and Novak columns. One liberal senator, whose voting record differs little from McGovern's, they wrote, feels McGovern's surging popularity depends on public ignorance of his acknowledged public position. The people don't know McGovern is for amnesty, abortion, and legalization of pot, he told us. Once Middle America, Catholic Middle America in particular, finds this out, he's dead. The phraseology was repeated almost identically by Scotty Reston 3 days later. George McGovern has run an intelligent and determined campaign and has now got to the top of the greasy pole, but with a heavy load of promises to slash the defense budget steeply, legalize pot and abortion, and grant amnesty to the Vietnam expatriates. Selling this to George Meany and the Labor Organization, which is about the only effective political organization the Democrats have, will not be easy, and it will not be very popular with many other Democratic candidates who think pot, abortion, and amnesty are explosively dangerous issues. The formulation was about one-half libel. Some prominent figures in American public life did indeed favor legalization of pot. They included William F. Buckley.
Yeah, not sure.
But that wasn't McGovern's position.
Absolutely.
His agreed with the recommendation of the President's National Commission on Marijuana and Drug Abuse, decriminalization, or lessening penalties, because statutes that defined at least 20 million Americans as criminals created a crushing burden for law enforcement agencies. He favored prioritizing in its place $1.5 billion for treatment of addiction to drugs such as heroin, not far off from a program the Nixon administration actually initiated. Nixon hoped it would help them announce reduced crime rates in time for the presidential election. Legalize abortion? McGovern was actively hostile to it, to his feminist supporters' chagrin. You can't just let anybody walk in and request an abortion, he told Time. Pat Nixon, in one of her rare press conferences, noted, I really am not for abortion, on demand, wholesale, adding that this was a question for the individual states, not as a national issue, which was precisely McGovern's position. But the invention that McGovern was pushing abortion and drug legalization took hold. The story contained a certain poetic truth, not about the policy issue specifically, but about the nation's polarization. The Chicago 7 trial had been a microcosm of that polarization, and McGovern had pleaded with Mayor Daley to dismiss the case. It was something hard-headed observers grasped better than either McGovern strategists in their 20s or the middle-aged men that worshipped youth. That success built by locking up the left-wing youth activist base might bear seeds of future defeat. McGovernites had discounted the signs. Like the man on the south side of Milwaukee who, asked by the young canvasser what he thought of McGovern, said, I'd vote for him if he turned Christian.
Chapter 1. Hell in the City of Angels. You might say the story starts with a television broadcast. It issued from the Los Angeles television station KTLA for 4 straight August days in 1965, culminating Sunday night, August 15th, with a 1-hour wrap-up. Like any well-produced TV program, the wrap-up featured its own theme music, pounding dissonant like the scores composer Bernard Herrmann produced for Alfred Hitchcock, and a logo, likewise jagged and glaring. It opened with a dramatic device, a voiceover redolent of the old LA police procedural Dragnet, elements familiar enough almost to make it feel like just another cops and robbers show. It was a hot and humid day in the city of Los Angeles, Wednesday, August 11th, 1965. The gravelly narration began. The City of Angels is the nation's 3rd largest metropolis. 2.5 million people live here in virtually an ideal climate, surrounded by natural beauty and the benefits of economic prosperity. Within the vast metropolitan spread live 523,000 Negroes. A sixth of them reside in southeastern Los Angeles in an area that is not an abject slum in the New York or Detroit context, but nonetheless 4 times as congested as an average area in the rest of the city. The community had prided itself on its relatively harmonious racial relations, few demonstrations, no massive civil disobedience, little trouble from militant factions. The camera tracks an ordinary-looking residential block, tree-lined and neat, a row of modest ranch houses fronted by postage-stamped lawns, suburban almost. The angle came from a helicopter. KTLA TV's telecopter was the first of its kind. The utility of the Korean War vintage Bell 47G5 with the camera affixed to its belly had so far been mostly prurient. Shots of the swimming pool where Marlon Brando's maid had drowned, of the well that swallowed a darling little girl, of movie stars' mansions being devoured by brush fires in the Hollywood Hills. Now the chopper was returned to its wartime roots. Los Angeles' black citizens were burning down their neighborhood. When the Watts riots began, television stations sent in their mobile cars to cover it. They were stoned like a scene from Leviticus. The next day, militants cautioned or threatened the TV crews not to come. They were all white, the enemy. There was even fear that KTLA's shiny red helicopter might be shot down by the same snipers peppering the firefighters who were trying to douse the burning blocks. The risk was taken, which was why the worst urban violence in American history ended up being shown live on TV for 4 straight days, virtually non-stop. Then, that Sunday night wrap, the narrator paused. The helicopter slowed to a hover at the end of a tree-lined block, lingering on a single bungalow on the corner. Its roof was gone, the insides blackened like the remains of a weekend barbecue. The voiceover intensified. Then, with the suddenness of a lightning bolt and all the fury of an infernal holocaust, there was hell in the city of angels. Cue the music, shrieking trumpets, pealing from television speakers in Southern California recreation rooms and dens, apartments and bars, wherever people gathered, pealing as heralds, because American politics, for those white middle-class folks who formed the bedrock of the American political conversation, could never be the same again. Until that week, the thought that American politics was on the verge of a transformation would have been judged an absurdity by almost every expert. Indeed, its course had never seemed more certain. Lyndon Johnson had spent 1964, the first year of his accidental presidency, redeeming the market, passing, with breathtaking aplomb, a liberal legislative agenda that had only known existence as wish during John F. Kennedy's lifetime. His Economic Opportunity Act of 1964, the War on Poverty, passed nearly 2-1. The beloved old General Dwight D. Eisenhower came out of retirement to campaign against the Kennedy-Johnson tax cut. But Lyndon Johnson passed that too. And then there was the issue of civil rights. Let this session of Congress be known as the session which did more for civil rights than the last 100 sessions combined, Johnson intoned on his first State of the Union address. It was just 5 weeks after John F. Kennedy's assassination, 7 months after Kennedy, alarmed by a wave of civil rights uprisings sparked in Birmingham, Alabama, had introduced the most sweeping civil rights bill since Reconstruction. It had been bogged down by Congress's recalcitrant conservative coalition of Northern Republicans and Southern Democrats. Even Martin Luther King's heroic hundreds of thousands of pilgrims marching on Washington couldn't unstick it. But President Johnson unstuck it. By June of 1964, the first session of the 88th Congress had indeed done more for civil rights than the last 100 sessions combined. Segregation in the United States in public accommodations was now illegal. Our Constitution, the foundation of our republic, forbids it. The principles of our freedom forbid it. Morality forbids it. And the law I signed tonight forbids it, Johnson said at a ceremony carried live on all 3 networks. What the ceremony marked was not merely a law, but a liberal apotheosis, an apparent liberal national consensus. Johnson's approval rating, even among Republicans, was 74%. Pundits and public opinion experts proclaimed him an exact match for the spirit of the age. So even did conservative businessmen. Speaking before the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the president was interrupted for applause some 60 times. They had reason to cheer. So dynamic had the American economic engine become that it was fashionable to presume that prosperity could fix any social problem. I'm sick of all the people who talk about the things we can't do, Lyndon Johnson told an aide in one of his patented exhortations. Hell, we're the richest country in the world, the most powerful. We can do it all. The Great Society was the name Johnson gave his ambition. It rests on abundance and liberty for all, he said in a May 22nd speech. A society of success without squalor, beauty without barrenness, works of genius without the wretchedness of poverty, The rhetoric was incredible. Still more incredible, it seemed regional. The Republican Party spent the year of the liberal apotheosis enacting the most unlikely political epic ever told. A right-wing fringe took over the party from the ground up, nominating Barry Goldwater, the radical right senator from Arizona, while a helpless Eastern establishment that was now a fringe looked on in bafflement. Experts, claiming the Republican tradition of progressivism was as much a part of its identity as the elephant, began talking about a party committing suicide. The Goldwaterites didn't see suicide, they saw redemption. This was part and parcel of their ideology, that Lyndon Johnson's consensus was their enemy in a battle for the survival of civilization. For them, the idea that calamitous liberal nonsense, ready acceptance of federal interference in the economy, Negro civil disobedience, the doctrine of containing the mortal enemy communism, when conservatives insisted it must be beaten, could be described as a consensus at all, was symbol and substance of America's moral rot. They also believed the vast majority of ordinary Americans already agreed with them, whatever staked the polls. Crazy figures. William F. Buckley harumphed. Dr. To say yes, Mr. President. It was their article of faith, and faith and the uncompromising passions attending it was key to their political making. That, the experts said, was exactly what made Goldwater so frightening. Unadulterated political passion was judged a dangerous thing by the dominant ideologists of American consensus. One of the deans among them, University of California President Clark Kerr, used to give his students a piece of advice that might as well have served as these experts' motto. A man should seek to lend his energies to many organizations and give himself completely to none. Lest all the competing passions cross-cut at a modern, complex society such as America's become irreconcilable, beyond compromise, a state of affairs Kerr could only imagine degenerating into all-out war. Here was no idle metaphor. I know that very often each of us did not just disagree. We poured forth our vituperation. The Episcopal Bishop of Fond du Lac, Wisconsin, wrote in a typical expression in late 1963. The accumulation of this hatred expressed itself in the bullet that killed John Kennedy. Opinion molders warned, with the numbness of habit, against extremists of the left and right, that veering too far from the center spurred the savage beast that lurked inside every soul. Goldwater, in accepting his party's nomination, had proudly declared that extremism in defense of liberty is no vice. Lyndon Johnson successfully framed his reformist agenda as something that was not ideological at all, conservative, simply a pragmatic response to pressing national problems, swept forward on ineluctable tides of material progress. The Democrats, in nominating Lyndon Johnson, made a rather careful decision to adhere to the rules of American politics, political scientist Clinton Rossiter wrote. The Republicans, in nominating Barry Goldwater, deliberately chose to ignore, to downgrade, perhaps to change these rules. And so, in November 1964, Lyndon Johnson won the grandest presidential victory since Franklin Delano Roosevelt's in 1936. There was an old saying in Iowa, overwhelmingly Republican from time immemorial. Iowa would go Democrat when hell went Methodist. Hell went Methodist in 1964, or at least Iowa's 7-man delegation to the House of Representatives went 5/7 Democratic. In Congress, Democrats now outnumbered Republicans more than 2-1. A bright new class of pro-Johnson liberals was swept in on his coattails, 47 in the House of Representatives alone. The right had been rendered a joke, an embarrassment, a political footnote, probably for good. I doubt that there has ever been so many people seeing so many things alike on Decision Day, Lyndon Johnson declared in acknowledging his victory on November 5th. These are the most hopeful times since Christ was born in Bethlehem, he said while lighting the White House Christmas tree. And in his January 4th, 1965 State of the Union address, he said, "We have achieved a unity of interest among our people that is unmatched in the history of freedom." He continued, "I propose that we begin a massive attack on crippling and killing diseases. I propose that we launch a national effort to make the American city a better and more stimulating place to live. I propose that we increase the beauty of America and end the poisoning of our rivers and the air that we breathe. I propose that we eliminate every remaining obstacle to the right and the opportunity to vote. I propose that we honor and support the achievements of thought and the creations of art. And he insisted that America would honor its pledge to the people of Vietnam, where, according to the public record, not a single American bomb had been dropped save in immediate retaliation for the Gulf of Tonkin incident, nor a single infantryman sent. Our goal is peace in Southeast Asia, the president intoned. That will come only when aggressors leave their neighbors in peace. What is at stake is the cause of freedom, and in that cause, America will never be found wanting. To ignore aggression now would only increase the danger of a much larger war. And that, to a vast majority of Americans, sounded perfectly reasonable. It all sounded reasonable. Johnson is almost universally liked, the left-wing Nation reported that week, hinting even that they rather liked him, too. Even the man who wrote Barry Goldwater's 1964 convention platform, Representative Melvin Laird of Wisconsin, said it would be suicidal for the Republicans to ignore the election results and try to resist any change in the party. A poll that month found that 65% of rank-and-file Republicans still called themselves conservatives. Should that two-thirds dominate their party's direction, warned two of the nation's most respected political scientists, we can expect an end to the competitive two-party system. The system wasn't all that competitive in any event. The Republican National Committee had been purged of Goldwater holdovers. One staffer, Frank Kovac, had been allowed to remain for his financial expertise. Throughout the spring, Kovac surreptitiously passed the RNC's private donor lists to right-wing groups that raised funds in competition with the Republicans. Party Chairman Ray Bliss found out and ordered him to stop. Kovac continued. So, on June 18th, 2 weeks after Bliss presided over a ceremonial RNC meeting meant to herald an era of Republican healing, his assistant broke into Kovac's desk. The break-in was bungled. Kovac alerted the press. That was the Republican Party in 1965. Lyndon Johnson took advantage of the weakened opposition. His hero was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Now he became Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Actually, he outpaced him. The liberals' struggle to pass federal funding for education had been a political dry hole since the New Deal. Johnson passed it in the House in March by a margin of 263 to 153. He then insisted the Senate pass the same bill without a single word change. The Elementary and Secondary Education Act passed the Senate 2 weeks later, with only 18 votes in opposition. He then turned the nation to dreams of immortality, proclaiming, "Heart disease, cancer, and stroke can be conquered, not in a millennium, not in a century, but in the next few onrushing decades." The down payment on the revolution was medical insurance for the elderly, funded out of Social Security contributions. Another stalled New Deal-era initiative, steered by Johnson past its permanent obstacle, the American Medical Association, the only major professional organization to back Barry Goldwater, by a 110-vote House margin. And then there was civil rights. The genesis of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 echoed the genesis of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, televised images of Southern sadism. In 1963, it had been Birmingham children set upon by fire hoses and police dogs. Now, Martin Luther King, the freshly minted Nobel Peace Prize laureate, came to Selma, Alabama, a town of 29,000, of which 15,000 were blacks of voting age. Only about 300 were registered to vote. Soon came mass arrests, including, on February 1st, the detention of 500 school children who had been transported to a state prison farm after the warning, "Sing one more freedom song and you are under arrest." When King himself was arrested, he published an open letter in the New York Times. "This is Selma, Alabama. There are more Negroes in jail with me than there are on the voting rolls." Soon after, troopers shot protester Jimmy Lee Jackson to death. The stage was set. A march was planned for March 7th down U.S. Highway 80, thereabouts known as the Jefferson Davis Highway, to the state capital, Montgomery, 50 miles to the east. At the far side of the point of embarkation, the Edmund Pettus Bridge, stood rank upon rank of Sheriff Jim Clark's officers and, outfitted in gas masks, cordons of Governor George Wallace's fearsome Alabama state troopers. The 600 marchers, clutching sleeping bags for the 5-day journey ahead, were ordered to disperse. They did not. The troopers rushed, clubs flailing, tear gas canisters exploding, white spectators wildly cheering them on. Then Jim Clark's forces on horseback, swinging rubber tubes wrapped in barbed wire, and bullwhips and electric cattle prods littered the bridge with writhing black bodies splattering blood. The film ran on national TV, over and over. On NBC, the broadcast cut into a showing of the film Judgment at Nuremberg, a story about what happens when ordinary citizens turn a blind eye to evil. Federal mediators negotiated safe passage for a peaceful march a week later. The next night, local thugs beat the Reverend James Reed, a white minister from Boston, to death. He had been watching Judgment at Nuremberg when his conscience directed him to travel to Selma. Lyndon Johnson was a man given to towering rages. Now he was angrier than any of his intimates had ever seen him. He prepared to give the greatest speech of his career. Outside the White House, left-wing picketers marched by bearing signs reading, "LBJ, just you wait. See what happens in '68. The threat, redeem the martyrs or be punished at the polls, seemed vile. Answering that yearning now appeared not just a moral imperative, but a political one. Yet no one was prepared for the moral force of the speech Lyndon Johnson gave to Congress and the nation on March 15th. He wrote it himself and delivered it over the objections of temporizing aides. It is wrong, deadly wrong, to deny any of your fellow Americans the right to vote in this country. There is no issue of states' rights or national rights. There is only the struggle for human rights. Their cause must be our cause too. Because it is not just Negroes, but really it is all of us who must overcome the crippling legacy of bigotry and injustice. Then, stunningly, he raised his arms in the air and invoked the slogan of a movement that was not too long ago perceived as the preeminent irritant to America's national unity. And we shall overcome. There followed the silence of a reaction too stunned for mere applause. Martin Luther King cried. Senators cried. Southern legislators cornered LBJ's befuddled mentor, Georgia Senator Richard Russell, and demanded an explanation for his protege's betrayal of his native South. They looked like heartless old jackasses. The next Selma procession on March 21st was celebratory. Thousands of singing marchers, ranks of glamorous celebrities on the floor, marching all the way through to Montgomery. That night, one of the white marchers, a Detroit mother of 5 named Viola Liuzzo, while humming "We Shall Overcome" in her car, was shot to death by the Ku Klux Klan because she was sitting next to a black man. The martyr only seemed to intensify the nation's moral resolve. Should we defeat every enemy, should we double our wealth and conquer the stars, and still be unequal to this issue, Lyndon Johnson had proclaimed, then we will have failed as a people and as a nation. He signed the Voting Rights Act of 1965 on August 6th under the Capitol building. He intoned about the slaves who came in darkness and they came in chains. Today we strike away the last major shackle of those fierce and ancient bonds. People cried. The Negro's cause was America's cause. Who could argue with that? Johnson, the Times agenda-setting pundit James Scotty Reston avowed, was getting everything through the Congress but the abolition of the Republican Party, and he hasn't tried that yet. The rioting in Los Angeles began 5 nights later. The spark came at the corner of 116th and Avenue. 2 black men, brothers, were stopped by a California highway patrolman at 7:19 p.m., the driver under suspicion of drunkenness. The 3 scuffled. A crowd gathered. Their mother came out from her house to quarrel with the cops. Then another woman joined the fight. The crowd thought the second woman was pregnant. She was wearing a barber's smock. When the cops struck the second woman, kicking a pregnant woman in the stomach, the mob surged as one. By 10:15, several hundred Watts residents were on the street, throwing things at white car passengers, staving in store windows, looting. Police tried to seal off the immediate area, but things had already spiraled out of control. The images came soon afterward, raw and ubiquitous. And because of a quirk of technology, The helicopter did not record its images on film, as most news cameras did, but via a microwave signal, live. KTLA fed it raw into people's homes for the next 4 days. As a public service, they shared their feeds with the other LA channels on the networks. You would see the helicopter hovering over a hapless lone individual turning a garden hose on a fire at an army surplus store, whose exploding ammunition had already kindled adjacent drug and liquor stores, as upward of 1,000 lingered to watch them burn and to harass the Good Samaritan as fire trucks approached and were turned away by a hail of bricks. You saw fire trucks escorted by 16 police cruisers to secure their passage, flames high enough to down power lines, the transformer in front of a furniture store about to blow, black smoke spreading second by second over a massive expanse of roof, then over the lion's share of the block, the helicopter tacking through banks of black smoke, looking for ribbons of light through which to capture the scurrying firemen below. The reporter narrates the action in surges and lulls like a demonic sports play-by-play. There is little that they can do. These buildings will be a total loss before they can get the first drop of water on the building. And another fire just erupted about a block away. And the spectators do not seem to be concerned by what's going on. Here are 2 kids running away from the fire right now. If the command center can see our picture, I would check the parking lot next to the National Dollar Store for 3 individuals. And now there's another building on fire on the north side of the street. There's another group of spectators. All they're doing is standing around and looking. They couldn't be less concerned. And now we have orders to climb higher into the air as pot shots are being taken from the ground, rifle fire and small arms fire, so we're pulling up and out. Then you saw the helicopter swath across 2 more miles of blazing streets to 51st and Avalon, where shots of a burning car turned on its back like a helpless scarab, the crowd guarding their treasure with a street barricade of picnic tables, park benches, and trash cans, the flames ascending heavenward. War breaking out in the streets of the United States of America, as if out of nowhere. The supposed American consensus had always been clouded. The experts had just become expert at ignoring the clouds. The violent feudal South had long been classed as a vestige, its caste-ridden folkways soon to be inundated by the flood tide of progress, hastened by the solving balm of federal intervention, just as in Selma. Social critics on the left thought the kind of violence you saw in the South might just represent the nation's future, not its past. But they too were ignored, seen as vestiges of the 30s, back when there wasn't a consensus. There had been race riots in the summer of 1964 in New York, Philadelphia, New Jersey, Rochester. And then, when Goldwater lost overwhelmingly, pundits systematically breathed a sigh of relief. White backlash doesn't develop, the New York Times headline. Backlash was developing, whatever the Times' triumphant conclusion. In a statewide referendum in California with Proposition 14, voters struck down the state's open housing law, which prevented property owners from discriminating against purchasers or renters on the basis of race by a proportion of 2-to-1, an anti-civil rights vote of almost the same size as the day's vote for President Johnson. A prominent liberal Southern newspaper editor, Samuel Talmadge Ragan, asserted that after the aberration of 5 Southern states going for Goldwater, leaders of both parties are confident that elections will be decided on issues other than civil rights. It was a perverse interpretation. In Mississippi, the presidential candidate who had voted against Johnson's 1964 Civil Rights Act won 87% of the vote, compared to the 24.7% Nixon had won in 1960. Yet Ragan's conclusions ran in the most respectable outlet imaginable, the sober quarterly American Scholar. American scholars, like liberals everywhere in early 1965, chose to bask in the sun. There had been violence on both sides in the presidential campaign. Vandalism against campaign offices, civil rights activists and conservative partisans assaulting one another, death threats against candidates. None of it was seen as a pattern. Watts was absorbed 6 days after the passage of the Voting Rights Act as a visitation from another planet. How is it possible after all we've accomplished? Lyndon Johnson cried in anguish. How could it be? Is the world topsy-turvy? Los Angeles radio station KNX fired its most popular call-in host. He insisted on talking about Watts. His bosses wanted him talking about anything but. In this way, consensus was institutionalized. Vietnam made the myth harder to sustain. Johnson had spent the first 13 months of his presidency in fits of sleeplessness, holding the line against further communist insurgency into South Vietnam, holding it against an escalating American commitment that might bring China and Russia actively into the fray, perhaps even forcing the threat of nuclear war. These were the Scylla and Charybdis through which Lyndon Johnson attempted to steer his Vietnam thinking. Some days it threatened to crack open his skull. Then, in January 1965, the latest in a series of South Vietnamese governmental coups led National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy to urge that America's present course, massive aid to Saigon, coupled with secret low-grade sabotage and airborne harassment, could only lead to disastrous defeat. The election was over, Bundy reminded his boss. The election in which Johnson had run as a peace candidate, even while authorizing elaborate plans not just to retaliate against communist insurgency, but to provoke a pretext to retaliate against. The pretext presented itself on February 7th, a deadly mortar attack on the American barracks of among the 23,000 U.S. advisors at Pleiku, the Vietnamese Central Highlands outpost Americans had been introduced to a few months back during Bob Hope's televised USO Christmas special. They had a ring of security around us bigger than anything since I hit the Orpheum circuit, he quipped from the makeshift stage, brandishing his golf club. What followed was codenamed Rolling Thunder, continuous air war against North Vietnam. What followed hard upon that was the landing of 2 Marine battalions to secure the bases from which the air raids were launched. By spring, there were 3,600 Rolling Thunder sorties a month, and 90,000 troops to secure them.
From me.
By mid-June, the pretense of defense was dropped altogether, as squads were sent out on the first major missions to search and destroy the enemy. They said that if you supported Goldwater, Bob Hope had quipped, America would end up in Vietnam. I forgot to take the Goldwater sticker off my car, and here I am. Not so funny now. Johnson lied about all of it, just as he lied about an April incursion of 20,000 Marines into the Dominican Republic, making up a story that the ambassador phoned him from underneath his desk as communist bullets ricocheted around the room. A young administration defense intellectual named Daniel Ellsberg said actually the Dominican Republic was one of the few communist-free environments in the whole world. By summer, plans were in place to put nearly 100,000 more American troops into Vietnam, though Johnson told the public the number was half that and denied any policy had changed. Few Americans will quarrel with President Johnson's determined conclusion to hold on in Vietnam, the newspaper of record editorialized the day after that announcement. Vietnam critics gathered exponentially. 14 were arrested for blocking the entrance of the U.S. mission to the United Nations in February. The first of 100 campus teach-ins by the end of the school year came days after the first Marines landed at Da Nang. At first, the administration sent spokesmen to these events, but they were so rhetorically manhandled for the gaps and contradictions in their presentations they stopped showing up. The biggest peace rally in the history of the Republic, organized by Students for a Democratic Society, the regnant New Left organization, brought 20,000 to D.C. on April 27th. SDS discussed a kamikaze plan to urge young men not to register for the draft, an explicit violation of the 1917 Espionage Act. But the Senate passed the president's $700 million Vietnam appropriation that spring 88-3. The Times subheaded its report on the SDS protest, Holiday from Exams. According to one poll, more Americans thought such protesters were tools of the communists than disagreed with Johnson on Vietnam. Johnson kept rolling out his Great Society, preschool for poor children, college prep for poor teenagers, legal services for indigent defendants, economic redevelopment funds for lagging regions, landmark immigration reform, a Department of Housing and Urban Development, national endowments for the humanities and arts, even a whole new category for the liberal agenda, environmentalism, a highway beautification act, a water quality act, a clean air act, bulldozed through as if the opposition from the big three automakers, the advertising industry, and the chemical industry weren't even there. The Republican National Committee could hardly raise the $200,000 each month necessary to keep its office open. The conservative organizations thriving the most, such as the John Birch Society, which had leveraged a successful membership drive out of the Goldwater defeat, were so far out that Republican leaders wanted little to do with them. The Washington Post editorialized of a party fighting off an attempted gigantic political kidnapping by fanatics. A party in smoldering ruins. Ghouls, the only sign of life. Only in hindsight did the report from the 33-year-old Morley Safer on August 5th from the village of Comney look like a foreshadowing of Watts. Marines torching a peasant village by touching off the straw roofs with cigarette lighters, what soldiers called a Zippo raid. This is what the war in Vietnam is all about, Safer narrated. To a Vietnamese peasant whose house meant a lifetime of backbreaking labor, it will take more than presidential promises to convince him that we are on his side. What wasn't on that film was even worse. A South Vietnamese cameraman persuading Marines not to aim a flamethrower into the warren in which women and children were hiding. In America, the first anti-war mass arrests soon followed. 300 collared on the Capitol steps at an assembly of unrepresented peoples, commemorating the 20th anniversary of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Brigades from Berkeley's Vietnam Day Committee made the most militant anti-war intervention yet, explicitly drawing parallels with the Germans who defied Hitler, standing in front of barreling troop trains shipping soldiers out for Vietnam, giving way like matadors only at the last possible moment. I felt I might die, one participant said, and that would be okay. Others burned their draft cards, even though a recently passed law made the act a federal crime. J. Edgar Hoover called them halfway citizens, who are neither morally, mentally, nor emotionally mature. We have achieved a unity of interest among our people that is unmatched in the history of freedom. Turn on the TV. Burning huts in Vietnam. Turn on the TV. Burning buildings in Watts. Turn on the TV. One set of young people were comparing another set of young people to Nazis, and Da Nang was equated with Nagasaki. Lyndon Johnson was being mocked. He was losing his consensus. The most frightening Watts footage did not require a telecopter. The morning after the first day, a series of calm intervals led officials to the false hope that the worst of the riot was over. The Los Angeles Human Relations Commission called a community meeting at Athens Park, 11 blocks from Ground Zero. A respected black minister with a polite little mustache made an appeal to stay off the streets. I think that the civil rights drive in America has demonstrated that violence will never be the just end to the grievances we have. He soon lost control of the meeting. A parade of locals stepped to the microphone with angrier and angrier grievances at the police, who were known to buck themselves up before ghetto tours of duty by crying, LSMFT, let's shoot a motherfucker tonight. At their rotting homes, 9 in 10 Watts houses were built before 1939, at the 30% black unemployment rate. Then a kid stepped up to the microphone. He was 16, but he looked younger. I'm going to tell it the way it is, he began. I'm going to tell you something. Tonight there's going to be another one, whether you like it or not. Murmurs. He raised his hand for attention, his face intensifying. Wait, listen. We, the Negro people down here, have got completely fed up. And you know what they're going to do tonight. They're not going to fight down here no more. You know where they're going. They after the white people. They're going to congregate. They're going to caravan out to Inglewood, to Marina del Rey. Someone tried to push him away from the microphone. And everywhere else, the white man's going to stay. They're going to do the white man in tonight. There was applause. The Human Relations Commissioner begged local stations not to air the clip that night. They showed it anyway. Angry whites had begun mobbing sporting goods stores. More TV images, these ones to scare Negroes. Caucasians sighting down the barrels of rifles, stockpiling bows and arrows, slingshots, any weapon they could lay their hands on. Race war seemed imminent. In the integrating community of Pasadena, a little girl lay awake at night wondering whether the new family moving in down the block was going to burn down her house while she slept, she remembered 40 years later. The terror was compounded by administrative chaos within Governor Edmund "Pat" Brown's Democratic administration. Brown was on vacation in the Mediterranean. Executive authority rested with his lieutenant governor, Glenn Anderson. By 7 a.m. Friday, the police announced the situation was rather well in hand. Lieutenant Governor Anderson, by then more worried about a situation brewing at Berkeley, student protesters were rumored to be planning a lie-in before a troop train, jetted north for a meeting of the University of California Regents. Within 2 hours, the violence in Watts started up worse than before, now in broad daylight. LA's police chief, William Parker, called Pat Brown's executive secretary to ask for the National Guard, a pro forma request. A maelstrom of misunderstanding and recrimination unfolded instead. Anderson, who mistrusted Parker as a blustering racist, held off. By the time Anderson made it back to Los Angeles, Parker refused to meet with him. At 4:15, Parker called a press conference to fulminate against a municipal stab in the back. Watts by then was 6,000 rampaging bodies, the most violent civil disturbance since the New York City draft riots of 1863. The first National Guard units hit the streets by 7 p.m., around the time the first rioter was shot by police. Pat Brown learned his city was out of control from the Athens Daily Post. He embarked on the 24-hour journey home, arriving back in time for a report from a French airline pilot upon his final approach to Los Angeles International that the view looked in no way different from the war zones he had overflown during World War II. Situation reports minute by minute to the president. Saturday, August 14th, 1700 hours. Riots are picking up tempo. No information on specific incidents such as siege of the police station and napalm factory. 1825. Defense Secretary Robert McNamara recommended LBJ dispatch C-13 transport planes to the California National Guard and send someone from the Department of Justice to stay close to Brown and give advice. 1945.
This one.
Looting reported but not verified at the Bank of America at Washington and Vermont. Also, report by police that they are unable to guarantee anyone's safety in area of 45 square miles surround Watts area. At 1:56 a.m., the draft of an executive order was cleared by McNamara for possible use. Now, therefore, by virtue of the authority vested in me by the Constitution and the laws of the United States, including Chapter 15 of Title 10 of the United States Code, particularly Section 331 and 334 thereof, it is hereby ordered as follows. Section 1. The Secretary of Defense is authorized and directed to take all appropriate steps to suppress the insurrection and domestic violence now in progress in the state of California. Section 2. In furtherance of the authority and direction contained in Section 1 hereof, the Secretary of Defense is authorized to use such of the armed forces of the United States as he may deem necessary. Section 3. I hereby authorize and direct the Secretary of Defense to call into the active military service of the United States, as he may deem appropriate to carry out the purposes of this order, any or all of the units of the Army National Guard and of the Air National Guard of the State of California to serve in active military service of the United States. It didn't quite come to that, though there would be occasion to consult this document again in years to come. Watts was subdued once and for all Sunday morning by 12,242 National Guardsmen, 20-year-olds, patrolling American streets in troop carriers with .30 caliber machine guns, looking like scared doughboys from General Pershing's Expeditionary Force, guarding the Harbor Freeway, a main Southern California artery that passed directly above the rioting, the imagined vector for some imminent black incursion on Greater Los Angeles. When KTLA aired its roundup documentary, Hell in the City of Angels, Sunday evening, they had to label the violent scenes videotape, lest viewers think the uprising was still ongoing, though that reassurance was subverted when they had to cut in with live footage of new rioting in nearby Long Beach. Cops in white helmets and the mien of Selma Sheriff Jim Clark were shown kicking backside, poking gun barrels into suspects, shouting things like, "First one drops their hands is a dead man," stepping over prostrate bodies stripped down to their underpants. The news got out. 4,000 arrests, 30 deaths, all but 5 of them black, some of them mere bystanders. The only peace officer to die had accidentally shot himself. The only fireman from standing next to a wall as it collapsed. Some whites noticed a pattern. In 1964, rioting had broken out a few weeks after the signing of the last civil rights law to end all civil rights laws. Watts wasn't even the only riot then. In Chicago, a black neighborhood went up after an errant fire truck killed a woman. Some whites noticed some liberal politicians seemed to be excusing the war. Time quoted Senator Robert F. Kennedy. There is no point in telling Negroes to obey the law. To many Negroes, the law is the enemy. But what were we left with without respect for the law? Time answered that question by quoting a husky youth. If we don't get things changed here, we're going to do it again. We know the cops are scared, and now all of us have guns. Last time, we weren't out to kill whites. Next time is going to be different. Lyndon Johnson, petrified, instructed federal agencies to pump $29 million into the neighborhood in secret for fear of charges that he was pandering to rioters, for fear that rising expectations would lead but to more chaos. Negroes will end up pissing in the aisles of the Senate. The Republican Policy Committee, meeting at the end of August, took a side on Watts. Chief Parkhurst, who argued that the civil rights movement was responsible for the violence. Congressman's mail changed overnight. People are saying that the Irish had their problems and the Italians had their problems, but that they didn't turn to civil disobedience, a West Pennsylvania Democrat told the president. Los Angeles' Democratic mayor, Sam Yorty, a Nixon supporter in 1960, began boasting of never having visited Watts and received a standing ovation from a businessman's luncheon when he said of the white Sacramento guardsmen sent down to his city, "What a difference between these fine young men and the people they were sent to control." The president pulled in his legislative reins, signing the law authorizing the establishment of a Department of Housing and Urban Development, only after arranging to stall the appointment of its designated secretary, Robert C. Weaver, who had served the federal government since his days as the New Deal's unofficial Negro ambassador, until January. Conventional wisdom converged on the president's credibility gap on Vietnam. Americans' doubts about their president were made flesh when he went under the knife in October for gallbladder and kidney stone surgery. Johnson had a habit of taking on maladies when stress on him was greatest. In 1948, he passed a kidney stone right before the agonizingly close Senate race that earned him the mocking nickname Landslide Lyndon. In 1955, he had a heart attack. This time, so many people presumed he was lying that he had really suffered another heart attack, that he shocked reporters by lifting his shirt to show them where the scar was. In the New York Review of Books, house organ for the left-wing intelligentsia, cartoonist David Levine drew the wound in the shape of Vietnam. Such were the political facts of life as 1966 approached. Though one more political fact of life, one more political force of nature should also be noted. Richard Nixon was on the road, doing what he had been doing since he had moved to New York in 1963. Since moments after he was crowned the job of American politics, the patron saint of losers, after his defeat against Pat Brown for California governor. Bookies gave him 1,000-to-1 shot that he would ever succeed in politics again. Nixon didn't take the tip. He was plugging away to become leader of the free world. The tasks to check off, yawning, numberless, and interminable. One evening, the task was breaking into the manor grounds of a millionaire. The politically retired Nixon had been traveling through 1965, giving rousing political speeches before Republican audiences in carefully selected locations. He also gave speeches to business clients in his capacity as a partner in the Wall Street firm Nixon, Mudge, Rose, Guthrie, and Alexander. Occasionally, the two tasks overlapped on the same trip, but not this time. He was in Miami to give a speech to the board of directors of a Minnesota-based company called Investors Diversified Services, and to visit with one of the rich industrialists who was backing his presidential play, Elmer Bobs of Warner Lambert Pharmaceuticals. He had brought along a retainer for the trip, a fellow law partner, Leonard Garment. He liked to have along a court and sanitaire to keep the celebrity matter at bay. the better to withdraw a bubble light within himself to prepare, which he always did obsessively for whatever task he set out to do. He had to have someone with him so he could be alone. Nixon and Garment repaired to the mansion of Nixon's patron for drinks. Then they had dinner at Bob's club. Then Nixon and his second were limousined off to the place they had been provided, through some favor or another, to spend the night. It was a house in a new suburban tract that was just starting to sell lots. Garment recorded what happened next in his memoirs. Nixon took one look at the place, and his always operational political instincts and suspicions told him that in the morning, the developers would expect to get pictures of him in the house in order to use his name and photograph for publicity purposes. It was the tiniest possible thing, but not for Richard Nixon, a small thing at all. To be photographed thus under circumstances not of his own control, in a city where he hadn't advertised his presence, would dilute his political capital by some appreciable amount, though probably only Richard Nixon was sensitive enough to measure it. Nixon ordered the driver back the hour or so to the magnate's house from whence they had come. When we arrived, after midnight, the gates were locked, Garment wrote. A high wall surrounded the estate. Nixon's next words were hard to forget. Come on, Garment, it's over the wall we go. And so, over the wall they clawed, briefcases in hand. Nixon had spied a pool house with twin beds inside. It turned out to be unlocked. They would sleep there. They stayed up half the night talking. Nixon told Garment he would do anything, make any sacrifice to get where he wanted to go. Anything, he said, except see a shrink. Scaling a pool house wall was even in its way routine.
Bruh. That last one was Maladetti. That was nuts. I was really feeling that one in the studio. So many layers. Madness going on. Love to hear that on a big system. Into this one, Elysium Groove by Mick Pointer. Old 90s techno thing. And I think it's a perfect track to end the show on. Thanks for joining me. My name is Fold. So yeah, just before I go, next up, I'm in Ireland with Joy O, doing a little mini tour. So if you're out there, get yourself to Galway, Cork, Dublin or Belfast. Then back to London. Can't remember when. Then I'm off to Salzburg in Austria. And that's the 6th of April. Thanks for locking in. Hope you've enjoyed the show. I'm back same time next month. Keep it NCS, yeah? Peace.
nts.